Tyler Simmons stood rigid in the center of the cold courtroom, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His heart pounded in his chest as he faced the towering judge's bench, feeling like the smallest person in the room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the packed courtroom. A hush had settled as Judge Evelyn Matthews, a stern-faced woman with sharp eyes, flipped through the case file in front of her. The weight of the moment pressed down on Tyler's shoulders. He had never set foot in a courtroom before, never even gotten so much as a detention in school. Yet, here he was, accused of trespassing in a park after dark. It had seemed harmless at the time. He and his friends were just hanging out, laughing about school and life, but apparently, it was against the law. "Tyler Simmons," Judge Matthews's voice rang through the chamber like a gavel striking wood. Tyler swallowed, his throat dry. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, though he could feel the tremor beneath it. The judge peered down at him, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing here today?" Tyler shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know I was breaking the law, Your Honor. I was just hanging out with my friends." Judge Matthews scoffed, shaking her head. "You kids," she muttered, more to herself than to the court. "No respect for rules, no sense of accountability." Tyler clenched his fists at his sides, resisting the urge to argue. He had been raised to respect authority, to keep his head down and his voice measured. "I'm really sorry, Your Honor," he said carefully. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." But his words barely seemed to register with her. She leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "You think you can just do whatever you want without consequence?" she said, her voice sharp. "I see kids like you in here all the time, always the same excuses." Tyler felt his stomach drop. "Kids like me?" The air in the room grew tense, but before he could say anything else, the judge straightened in her seat. "You're lucky this is a minor offense," she said. "But make no mistake, young man, next time you won't get off so easily." Tyler lowered his head, biting back the frustration rising inside him. He knew this wasn't about just a curfew violation. It was about something much bigger, and deep down, he knew this wouldn't be the last time someone tried to put him in his place. Tyler kept his gaze on the worn-out floor beneath him, gripping the fabric of his jeans to keep his hands from shaking. He had been taught to respect authority, to stay calm, to never raise his voice, but nothing had prepared him for what came next. Judge Matthews let out a scoff, shaking her head. "Typical," she muttered, just loud enough for the courtroom to hear. Tyler's stomach twisted. "Another black teen, thinking they can get away with breaking the law," she said, her voice cold and unyielding. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Tyler's mother, sitting in the front row, inhaled sharply, her hands gripping the edges of her chair. Tyler's lawyer shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The prosecutor, an older man in a stiff gray suit, looked down at his notes, pretending not to hear. Tyler felt his pulse in his ears. Had she really just said that? Judge Matthews, oblivious to, or perhaps enjoying the tension she had created, continued. "You're just another statistic, aren't you?" Her eyes bore into him like he was already a lost cause. "Another black kid who thinks the rules don't apply to them. You'll never amount to anything if you keep acting like this." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. The courtroom fell into a suffocating silence. Tyler felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him, some filled with sympathy, others with curiosity, and a few with silent agreement. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to say that he wasn't some delinquent who thought the rules didn't apply to him. But no words came out. His mind raced with a storm of emotions, anger, humiliation, confusion. His mother had always told him that life wouldn't always be fair, that he would have to work twice as hard to be seen as half as good. But this was something else entirely. His lawyer finally cleared his throat, shifting beside him. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my client has no prior offenses, and this is a minor infraction." Judge Matthews waved a dismissive hand. "Save it," she snapped, I've seen this before. They start with something small, and before you know it, they're standing here again for something worse. This boy needs to learn a lesson now before it's too late. Tyler clenched his fists. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was being painted as a criminal before he even had a chance to prove otherwise. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't about the law. This was about something much bigger, and he wasn't going to forget it. The tension in the courtroom shifted as Judge Matthews slowly flipped through the pages of Tyler's file. The room, once buzzing with silent judgment and unspoken assumptions, now hung in an eerie stillness. The judge's face, previously stern and condescending, flickered with something unreadable. Was it doubt? Surprise? She cleared her throat, her voice suddenly lacking the same edge. "What is this?" she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Her eyes darted across the document, scanning line after line. There's no record here. No history of behavioral problems. She turned another page. No prior arrests. For the first time since Tyler had stepped into the courtroom, she hesitated. "This kid is clean," she muttered under her breath. The words rang through Tyler's mind like an echo. This kid, not Mr. Simmons, not the defendant, but this kid. As if she had just now realized that he was more than whatever assumption she had made about him the moment he walked in. Judge Matthews looked up from the file, locking eyes with Tyler for the first time, without the weight of preconceived judgment. "You're not what I thought?" Tyler felt his chest tighten. He had been saying that all along. Had she ever listened? "I told you, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I've never been in trouble before." The judge's gaze flickered back to the file, now turning to a section that detailed Tyler's academic record. Honor roll, leadership programs, community service, volunteer work at the local shelter, a kid who spent his weekends tutoring younger students instead of getting into fights. A kid who had plans, ambitions, and a future ahead of him. A kid who didn't fit the stereotype she had so quickly assigned to him. Judge Matthews leaned back in her chair, suddenly aware of the silence in the room. The spectators, the lawyers, even the court staff, they were all waiting. No one dared to speak. It was evident now. Tyler wasn't just another statistic. He wasn't a reckless teen on the verge of a criminal record. He was a young man with integrity, intelligence, and promise. And she had nearly condemned him without so much as a second thought. For the first time in a long time, Judge Matthews felt the weight of her own bias pressing down on her shoulders. Tyler could see it, and he wasn't going to let her forget it. Judge Matthews exhaled deeply, a flicker of regret crossing her usually composed face. The weight of her own words from earlier echoed in her mind, words she had carelessly thrown at a young man who had done nothing to deserve them. She had let stereotypes shape her judgment instead of facts, and now, staring at the truth in black and white, she felt something unfamiliar. Shame. She laced her fingers together, hesitating before speaking again. "Tyler," she said, her voice quieter than before, lacking the usual authority it carried. I owe you an apology." Tyler blinked, caught off guard. He had expected a harsh lecture, maybe even an unjust sentence, but not this. The judge straightened in her chair, trying to regain some control over the situation, but her voice wavered. "I misjudged you," she admitted. "I let my assumptions get ahead of the truth, and that was wrong." She glanced at the open file on her desk once more, as if needing another reminder of the mistake she had made. Tyler held her gaze, his emotions conflicting. He had been taught to respect authority, to trust the justice system, but standing here now, he couldn't ignore the sting of what had just happened. An apology didn't erase the humiliation he had felt when she dismissed him before even hearing his case. It didn't erase the way she had looked at him like he was already guilty. But still, he knew how rare this moment was. A judge admitting fault. To him? "Thank you," he said, his voice measured but cautious. Judge Matthews nodded, then addressed the courtroom, her words carrying a newfound awareness. This case should have never been about anything more than the facts. Tyler Simmons is not a criminal. He made a mistake, one that many young people make, but it does not define him. She turned back to Tyler. And I will make sure this moment does not define you. She picked up her gavel, but hesitated before bringing it down. Case dismissed. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Tyler let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. He was free. But more than that, he had just witnessed something rare. A person in power owning up to their bias. As he turned to leave, he saw the faintest hint of something in Judge Matthews's eyes. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the beginning of change. Either way, Tyler knew one thing. This moment would stay with her, just as it would stay with him. Judge Matthews took a deep breath, her hands gripping the bench as she addressed the entire courtroom. The same authority she had used to chastise Tyler now carried a different weight, one of reflection, of responsibility. I have spent years on this bench believing that my role is to uphold justice fairly, she began, her voice firm but uncharacteristically vulnerable. But today, I failed in that duty. I judged this young man before I even heard his case. I let my assumptions cloud my ability to see the truth, and that is unacceptable. A murmur ran through the room. Court reporters glanced at one another, attorneys stiffened in their seats, and even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. No one had ever heard a judge admit fault so openly. Judge Matthews turned back to Tyler. Mr. Simmons, I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you my commitment to do better. You should have never been made to feel as though you were less than anyone else in this courtroom. I see now that you are not just a young man who made a mistake. You are a young man with integrity, with promise, and with a future far brighter than I initially gave you credit for. Tyler swallowed hard, his emotions a mix of relief, disbelief, and something else. Pride. He had stood before a system that had nearly dismissed him and had come out on the other side not just as an innocent young man, but as someone who had changed a person in power. Judge Matthews looked at him directly. I want to make this right. This case is dismissed, and I will ensure that no record remains attached to your name. The words hit Tyler with a wave of relief. His future was safe. His hard work, his dreams, and everything he had been striving for wouldn't be overshadowed by one unjust moment. Thank you, Your Honor, he said, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of what had just happened. As he turned to leave, something incredible happened. One by one, people in the courtroom began to clap, not just for Tyler, but for the lesson learned that day. Even some of the officers, attorneys, and clerks nodded in approval. Tyler had walked into the courtroom as a defendant, but he was leaving as something more, a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of bias, truth and dignity could still prevail. In the days that followed, Tyler's case became more than just a courtroom moment. It became a conversation starter. His school, his community, and even local media picked up the story, turning it into a powerful lesson about bias and justice. At school, teachers referenced his case in discussions about fairness and equality, and students who had never spoken to him before began to see him in a different light. Man, I heard what happened, one student told him in the hallway. That was messed up, but the way you handled it, that was powerful. Tyler hadn't set out to change the system. He had only wanted to be treated fairly, but now his experience was forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about how young black men were often seen and judged before they even had a chance to prove themselves. Meanwhile, Judge Matthews didn't let the moment fade away. She requested a meeting with other judges in the district, openly admitting that she had let personal biases cloud her judgment in Tyler's case. She pushed for new training on racial bias for courtroom officials, determined to make sure that what happened to Tyler never happened again. I never thought I'd say this, she admitted in a private discussion with her colleagues. But that young man taught me more about justice in 10 minutes than I learned in my first 5 years on this bench. Tyler's parents, proud but still shaken by what had nearly happened to their son, used the moment to educate others in the community. They spoke at town hall meetings, encouraging discussions on how the legal system could be improved for young black men who often faced discrimination before they even had a chance to speak. For Tyler, life went on, but he carried himself differently now. He had stood up to injustice, and in doing so, he had changed not just his own path, but the perspective of an entire town. One afternoon, as he walked past the courthouse on his way home, he stopped and looked at the building that had once felt like an enemy. Now, it felt like something else, a place where, for the first time, real change had begun. Maybe, he thought to himself, this is just the start. As the graduation ceremony filled the auditorium with cheers and applause, Tyler stood proudly in his cap and gown, his heart pounding with a mixture of pride and determination. The moment he had worked so hard for was finally here, but it meant so much more than just receiving a diploma. It was a testament to everything he had overcome: the injustice, the doubts, and the challenges that had once threatened to define him. His parents beamed with pride from the front row, his mother wiping away tears of joy, while his father gave him a firm nod of approval. His classmates, some of whom had been there during his trial, now looked at him with admiration rather than indifference. They had seen him stand up for himself, and in doing so, he had inspired them to question the biases that existed all around them. As he walked across the stage, the principal extended a handshake. "Tyler Simmons," she announced, her voice ringing through the auditorium, "a young man of integrity, strength, and a future that will change lives." The crowd erupted in applause, but Tyler barely heard it. His mind was already focused on what lay ahead: college, law school, and eventually, a career in fighting for justice. He wanted to ensure that no one else had to go through what he did. He wanted to be the person standing in the courtroom, not as the accused, but as the defender of those who were unfairly judged. As he stepped off the stage, he noticed someone standing near the back of the room, Judge Matthews. She had come, not as an official, but as a person who had learned, from her mistakes. She gave him a small nod of respect, an unspoken acknowledgement of how much that one moment in the courtroom had changed both of them. Walking out into the bright afternoon sun, diploma in hand, Tyler took a deep breath. This was only the beginning. The world was waiting, and he was ready.